Section 3 of Under the Guns by Annie Wittenmyer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Army Tricks. There were many tricks played on the officers just for the fun of the thing during the war, especially if the troops remained long at any one camping place. In one of the many camps of the Union soldiers an odd trick was played off on the surgeon and chaplain of a regiment noted for its merrymaking. The troops were camped by a small stream over which was a narrow rickety bridge. Just across from the camp was a log cabin in which lived an old woman alone. The woman paid no attention to the soldiers, but went about her daily duties as though unconscious of their presence. One day some of the boys passed the cabin, and hurrying over the rickety bridge, came running into the camp with the message, "The old woman in the cabin is dying." The chaplain and surgeon were notified. "Chaplain, hurry over quick! The old woman is dying." The chaplain hurried over the rickety bridge as rapidly as possible. The surgeon soon followed. As the chaplain came round to the open door he saw at a glance that it was a trick, and he passed on around the house so as to allow the surgeon to come on and bear a full share of the joke. The woman was dying. She was over a kettle of butternut juice dying a lot of yarn. When the two came back over the bridge the whole camp was in a roar of laughter over the joke. But what could be done? The men had reported a truth. The woman was dying. So there was no redress. General Grant's Kindness. One morning during the war, coming down on the packet boat that plied between Cairo, Illinois, and Columbus, Kentucky, I noticed a woman weeping as though her heart would break. Her calico dress and coarse blanket shawl betokened abject poverty, and her face was hidden; and she sobbed out her anguish in a coarse bandana handkerchief. Laying my hand gently on her shoulder, I said, "My dear woman, what is the matter?" "It's my boy I'm crying about. He's awful sick down in Tennessee, and he has writ for me to come down and nuss him up. But the men as keeps the passes at Cairo says I can't go. They say there's plenty to take care of my boy, and maybe there is, but I reckon that his mother what took care of him when he was a baby could do it better nor any of them. My boy was a very smart boy. You never seen a smarter boy nor a better boy than mine was. Well, if they won't let me go down on the railroad I reckon I can walk. My boy's sick and I'm bound to go. They tried to skeer me by tellin' me the guards would arrest me if I tried to get through the lines. But I can dodge the guards and creep under the lines. Anyway, I s'pose them guards are human creeturs, and if I tell 'em my boy is a soldier, and awful sick, wants his mother to come down and nuss him, they'll let me go through." "Have you his letter with you?" "Yes, I have." And out of the depth of a capacious pocket she drew forth a package, and carefully unrolling it she handed me a letter. It was short, but full of tender pathos. The boy was sick and homesick, and wanted his mother. Among other things he said, "You could nuss me better than the boys. I ain't got no appertite, and can't eat nothin'. The boys hain't much on cookin', but you could cook something that I could eat, and maybe I'd get well." Satisfied that she was a true woman and not a spy, I said, "General Grant, the highest officer in the army, is on this boat. He can give you a pass. He was sitting here by this table a few minutes ago. As he has left his paper and writing material there, he will no doubt return in a few minutes. Go to him, and show him your boy's letter and ask him for a pass. He will give it to you." She was almost dismayed at the thought of speaking to such a great man. When the general came in and took a seat at the table, I whispered to her, "Now go. Don't be afraid." The meeting of the two was a picture for an artist. With sunbonnet pushed back and her coarse shawl drawn closely about her, she timidly approached him, holding out the letter. General Grant looked up kindly. "Are you General Grant?" she questioned. "Yes." "Well, my boy's awful sick down in Tennessee, and he's writ me this letter to come and nuss him up. But them men at Cairo what gives passes said I might be a spy, and they wouldn't give me a pass. But, General, I hain't no spy. I'm a good Union woman as ever lived,
And there's a lady here as allowed that if I'd ask you, maybe you'd give me a pass."
In the meantime General Grant had looked over the letter and scrutinized the woman, and handing the letter back to her, he said: "Yes, I'll give you a pass. What is your name?" The woman gave her name, but she was so delighted that she talked all the while he was writing the pass.
"It's awful unhandy for me to leave home now, 'cause I hain't nobody to take care of nothin'. Bill Spence's wife, she agreed to milk the cow, but I had a beautiful pig, and I had to turn that out to root for itself, and I'm awful feared that it will get lost while I'm gone. But I told Miss Spence that I'd ruther risk the pig than to risk my boy, for he's an awful good boy, Gineral." "This pass will take you down and bring you back," said General Grant, handing her the precious document. "How much do you s'pose it'll cost me to go down?"
"It will cost you nothing, madam. The pass will take you free."
"Don't they charge nothin' on them roads?"
"They will not charge you. A mother who has given her son to the government can afford to carry free." Just then I got her attention, and betokened her away.
"I'm very much obliged to you, Gineral," she said,
and made an old fashioned curtsy. Years afterward, while he was an occupant of the White House and I was there on a friendly visit, I reminded him of the circumstance, which he had almost forgotten, and expressed the hope that the boy had recovered, and that she had found her pig on her return. He smiled and said: "I always let the mothers pass if their boys were sick, and they seemed to be good loyal women." I had noticed that General Grant did not judge by appearance or dress. Often the lady in her silks was turned back, while a woman arrayed in calico would go through the lines. Army life at Helena, Arkansas. Helena, Arkansas, was an important military station in 1862-63. In December, 1862, General Sherman, with his great fleet of boats, and an army of 20,000 or 30,000 men, moved from that point down the Mississippi River upon Vicksburg. There was nothing in the place of itself that made it a desirable camping ground for troops, other than it was an advanced station far down into the enemy's country, and commanded considerable important territory. The soldiers called it a "God forsaken place." It was named after the daughter of the founder of the town, Helena; but the soldiers suggested that the name ought to be spelled with one syllable and two L's. Along the river front the land was very low and subject to overflows, but was protected by a high embankment which effectually shut out the flood tides of the Mississippi River. Just back of the town was a great green cypress swamp, that was crossed by a corduroy road, a road made of large round logs fastened together at each end. Back of the swamp rose high bluffs of yellow clay. They were unsightly and very precipitous; in most places perpendicular. Their uneven sides were seamed and wrinkled by the floods and storms of ages, and looked like a line of forts. It is easy to imagine the discomfort of such a camping place. During the winter and spring the streets of the town were miry and almost impassable. In December, 1862, I reached Helena with a heavy load of hospital supplies. I sent a message to my friend, General Cyrus Bussey, who was Assistant Secretary of the Interior during President Harrison's administration, but who was then in command, requesting an ambulance that I might visit the several hospitals. He sent me a note saying that it would be impossible to get about in an ambulance, but that if I wished he would send me an army wagon. Of course I accepted the offer. A big wagon with 4 good strong mules attached was sent me. A camp chair was put in for my use; and Chaplain P. P. Ingalls offered to accompany me, and took a seat with the driver on a board which had been placed across the wagon bed. We started down the principal street of the town towards the steamboat landing; but we had not gone far till the team began to mire. The mules made a desperate struggle to get out, and the driver tried to turn them towards the sidewalk; but the more they struggled the deeper they sank into the black mire of the street. The mules were in up to their sides, and the wagon had sunk down almost to the bed. Immediately a crowd of soldiers gathered on the board sidewalk. They had been through many a miry place, and knew just what to do. Boards from the near fence and rails were brought, and soon the space was bridged between the struggling mules and the board sidewalk. The mules were soon detached from the wagon, poles and rails were used to pry them out, and ropes were put about them, and they were pulled by main force to the sidewalk. As the boards on which the men stood sank down in the mud, other boards were brought and laid on top of them, and many willing hands made the work of rescue possible. The last mule to be rescued was up to his sides in the mire. It seemed almost impossible to get a rail down under him, or to get ropes about him, so as to help him. But at last, covered with black mud and almost exhausted, he stood on the board sidewalk. Chaplain Ingalls and myself were then rescued, the wagon was abandoned, and a board put up, "No bottom," to warn others. A terrible storm at Chattanooga. How the men in the hospital tents were saved from freezing. On the night of December 31st, 1863, a fearful storm swept over the Southern States, extending from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic coast. I was at Chattanooga at the time. The tempest came down upon us like an Arctic hurricane. It beat and tore around the cliffs of Lookout Mountain and down its gorges, leveling trees, and freezing the life currents in every unprotected living thing. Many of the guards on duty in the army that night froze to death. General Russell A. Alger, who was in front of the army in the Eastern Army that night, tells of his ride along the picket line. As the position of his forces was a dangerous one, he desired to assure himself that the guards were at their posts of duty. At one point, where the lines of the two armies came close together, and the danger was especially great, a trusty soldier had been posted. As General Alger approached that point, he was surprised at not being halted, and he felt sure the guard was asleep. "Why do you not challenge me, sir?" he demanded. There was no response. Taking the man by the shoulder, General Alger was shocked to find him dead. Standing against a tree facing the enemy that terrible night, with eyes and ears on the strain, intent on doing his duty well, he had frozen to death. At Chattanooga there was great suffering from scarcity of food and clothing, and lack of proper protection. The railroad had been repaired to Bridgeport only, and it was necessary to haul all the supplies of that great army from Bridgeport to Chattanooga, a distance of 28 miles, and over a rough, stony mountain road. The army had marched over this road to Mission Ridge and Chickamauga, and their shoes had been cut to pieces on the sharp rocks. Many of the men were almost barefooted. They were 236 miles inland from their base of supplies. Every bridge had been destroyed, and every foot of the long line of railroad had to be guarded. Those of us who ventured to travel over that dangerous route had to take the chances, both of obstructions on the track, and volleys of musketry from ambuscades. When the storm fell upon the army at Chattanooga, the troops lacked both food and clothing. At the foot of Lookout Mountain there was a large field hospital, at which were quartered the men who were most severely wounded and sick. The men were sheltered by large tents and lay on cots. There were no floors in these tents, and no arrangements for heating them. Mrs. Jeremiah Porter of Chicago, a dear little saint who is now in heaven, had gone to Chattanooga with me; and we were together at the rooms of the Christian Commission when the storm burst upon the place in its terrible fury. Amid the raging of the tempest, which made every timber in the old frame building creak, and threatened to tear away the roof that covered us, our first thought was of the men in the field hospital who were exposed to its fury. Night as it was decided that we should go to their relief. While the delegates were getting out the horses and ambulances, everything that would be likely to add to the comfort of the patients was collected from the stores on hand. It was about daybreak when we started. The way was lined with dead mules and horses frozen to death. Half starved and unsheltered, they could not live in such a storm. The muddy roads were now frozen. The wind was in our faces, and the 2 miles we had to travel seemed a long journey. When we reached the hospital our worst fears were realized. Many of the tents had been blown down upon the faces of the helpless men. Against the fierce northern blasts which threatened to tear the tents into tatters, the attendants were striving to right them. But the force was small compared to the work which needed to be done. To leeward of the camp 3 great log fires were blazing and crackling furiously. Mother Bickerdike, a grand old army nurse who did heroic service in the hospitals from the beginning until the close of the war, was there, and giving directions with the clearness and force of a sea captain in a storm. Orders were imposed on all of us before we were out of the ambulance. "Come on, Lawrence, with your men, and help get up these tents. Mrs. Wittenmyer, you and Mrs. Porter get sticks and pry out rocks, and heat them here in these fires and put them about the men to keep them from freezing." We all went to work at once. No one stood upon the order of his going. With such sticks as we could pick up it was hard to pry out the rocks, but we were willing, and we succeeded. One delegate had brought a lot of reading matter with him, and we utilized them as wrappers for the hot rocks, which we carried in our arms to the cots, creeping under the flapping canvas when the tents were down, and putting them around the men the best we could, and speaking at the same time words of cheer which they so much needed. I thank God that because of the heroic and timely efforts which were made, not one man froze to death in the tents that day. The great log fires, we learned later, had been built from a part of a fort surrendered by the Confederates. Mother Bickerdike, not finding suitable wood for fires which could withstand a tempest, suggested to the surgeon that such timbers as they could get out of the two forts be used for that purpose. But as the forts were government property the surgeon refused to touch them without an order. Military headquarters were 2 miles away, and the tempest was raging. Mother Bickerdike rose to the emergency as usual. "Come on, boys," said she, "we'll soon have the timbers out of the old fort. What possible use can Uncle Sam put them to?" The surgeon warned her that it would be his duty to report the matter to the proper authorities. "That's all right, doctor, but in the meantime we'll have the fires going." Of course nothing was ever done about it. We toiled all day. As the tents were raised we carried great pans and kettles full of live coals into the tents, and emptied them on the ground to temper the keen air, which seemed to pierce to the marrow. I had brought up the river with great difficulty a special store of supplies, transporting them in a small boat through the special kindness of General John A. Logan, who had detailed the boat for that purpose. Among the supplies was the largest lot of good woolen home knit socks I had ever seen together. Many sacks of them had been pitched into the ambulance that morning, and as we went through the tents we examined the feet of the men to see if they were frozen. We put socks on the feet that were bare, and kept the hot boulders moving back and forth to aid all. Many of the men had on good socks which had been sent to them by mail, but the feet of many were bare. I shall never forget the stone bruised feet on which we put warm woolen socks that day. At last the work was well nigh done. The wind had abated, the tents were up, and our supplies were nearly all distributed. We had reached the last tent, and the last 2 men in the tent. I turned to the last sack to draw out 2 pairs of stockings for the 2 men before us, but there was only 1 pair in the sack. "Oh, Mrs. Porter, what shall I do? There are 2 men and only 1 pair of socks!" I exclaimed in despair. To my surprise the men began to laugh, and one of them said, "There is no great loss without some small profit, Jim," and they laughed again heartily. At last one of them explained, "You see, miss, we've each of us lost a leg, and 1 pair will do us both." And this was true. They had been brought into the tent for the amputation and laid side by side. We were both deeply impressed. I had not counted the feet or the socks, but He who counts the hair of our heads had counted both. Mrs. Porter and I divided the 1 pair between us, and each put a sock on the 1 foot. Tears of sympathy blinded our eyes as we remembered that henceforth these 2 heroes must walk lame through life. It was wonderful with what heroism these men could bear their sufferings and losses. They were full of hope, and grateful for every little kindness. They literally overwhelmed me with thanks. But it was left for an Irishman to express his thanks for timely help in the most original manner. He said, in the most impassioned tones, his face all aglow, "And sure it's an angel ye are, and may ye be in heaven 3 weeks before the devil finds out ye're dead." The Wonderful Potato Patch. In the spring of 1862 potatoes were very scarce and dear. The women of Muscatine, Iowa, who were earnest workers in the Soldiers' Aid Society of that town, were anxious to secure potatoes to send to the army. They decided to canvass the town and the region round about for that purpose. But the first grocery they entered the proprietor said, "No, I have no potatoes to spare; but I have a field about a mile out of town that you may have the use of, if you wish to raise potatoes." The proposition was accepted gladly, and they at once began to solicit potatoes for planting. At the appointed day for planting, the loyal old men who had not gone to the front, and the women and children, rallied for the work. Wagons were in readiness to carry out the plows, harrows, hoes, and potatoes. The men plowed and harrowed and furrowed the ground; the women and children followed, dropping and covering the potatoes, and the field in due time was planted. When the time came to cultivate the potatoes, a "potato picnic" was announced; and when the day arrived wagons were in readiness to take all who were willing to work to the field. A picnic dinner was served, and although the work was hard, these hours of toil were enlivened with laughter and song and wit and wisdom; and the weeds were destroyed and the potatoes cultivated. And so it was each time when the cultivation of the field was needed. Happily the Colorado beetle, known as the potato bug, had not been heard of as yet. But there came a time of drought and great anxiety, for men and women too, for women toiled in the fields in those heroic days. They watched the clouds with sinking hearts as they sailed carelessly by, giving never a drop of rain to revive vegetation and moisten the parched earth. Every one felt as much interest in the potato field the women had planted as though it had been their own. There are perhaps a score or more of men and women still living in that loyal town, who will remember that "sanitary potato patch," and the remarkable fact that one day a cloud sailed over it and drenched the field with rain, scattering only a few sprinkles over the fields adjoining. The yield of that potato field was immense, and the entire crop was in time shipped to me at St. Louis and distributed in camps and hospitals. I do not now remember how many bushels they raised on that patch of ground, but I distinctly remember that they sent me by one shipment 1,500 bushels of potatoes. Never were potatoes more needed, or more acceptable to men suffering from that army scourge, scurvy, than were those 1,500 bushels distributed to Iowa soldiers and to all in the general hospitals. To me the supply seemed inexhaustible. One of the first stops made by the steamer sent down with them was at Island No. 10, above Memphis, Tennessee, where 100 bushels were put off, with the injunction that they must be divided equally among the men and officers of an Iowa regiment stationed there. There were over 1,000 men in all. On my return trip the steamer stopped again at Island No. 10. My feet had scarcely touched the shore till I was surrounded by soldiers, who reported that the officers had eaten up most of the potatoes, and that they had been given only about 3 messes. I was indignant, and went directly to the colonel's headquarters with a complaint. He was greatly surprised, and sent for the quartermaster and other officials, who listened to the complaints very serenely. When they had heard all I had to say, the quartermaster said, "You only gave us 100 bushels of potatoes. How long did you think they would last?" "About a month, I thought." "We have 10 companies of 100 men each. Every company got 10 bushels. That, divided among 100 men, would only give them about 2 messes apiece." "That is so," I confessed with some confusion. "I see," he continued, "that you are not accustomed to feeding armies." "If that is the way they eat, I don't want the task of feeding them. I accept your explanation, and beg you to excuse my ignorance in these matters." And so we parted. I had a few minutes later, as the boys gathered about me at the landing, the privilege of explaining why they did not get more than 2 or 3 messes of potatoes; that there were too many of them; that if there had been 10 men and 100 bushels of potatoes, instead of 1,000 men and 100 bushels of potatoes, they would have fared better. End of Section 3